Today I'm going to be speaking on a topic that I've actually spent more time considering than I would most of the time for most topics, because I wanted to develop my thinking surrounding it. And it's always tough to know exactly how to go about learning a certain how to research stuff, and I still don't really know. But my hope is that, and I say that because I feel like I came into it with a certain perspective, and I'm kind of coming out with the same perspective, but I want to share with you why I believe what I do. And my hope is that I can get better at reasoning through doing this. But today I want to make a defense of centrism as a political philosophy, and immediately something that is important answer when I say this is, well, why would a defense need to be made? In order for a defense to make sense, there has to be something to defend against. And I do believe that there is in the case of centrism, because it seems to me that as of late, the public perception of centrism is not a particularly positive one, and I want to talk about that. So centrists, people that are described as centrists, are often viewed as cowardly, as pushovers, as do-nothings, and they don't accomplish their aims. They're ineffective at getting what they desire. And fundamentally, a lot of things come down to definition, but I think this is I think that's particularly true in this case, that it comes down to how are we defining what a centrist is, because there is a version of centrism that doesn't make any sense, but I don't think it's the one that most people are really buying into when we talk about centrism. So I do believe that there are positives to taking a centrist outlook, and that ultimately being a centrist leads to better decision making. But I wanted to discuss the perception of centrism and defend it a little bit against what I view as just a problem of definition, really. And, well, let me just say that fundamentally what I find so important about this is that I think that if more people do take the approach that I believe is valuable here, we will live in a better society where more positive decisions are made, and ultimately that will be a good thing. But before I do this, I want to actually discuss some views on centrism, and where I went to find these views was Reddit. So maybe not the best place to go, but man, it's hot. I'm not gonna lie. I don't think I can do this. It's freaking hot. But I'm gonna keep going because, it's whatever. Okay. So here's one argument against centrism, and I want to respond to it. So this person says, and I think this was a response to somebody's main post: if I can find the Reddit thread again, I will try to link it to this video. But what about when scientific facts and data are clearly and strongly in favor of the opinions of one side? People walking on the center line in that case are just as off base as the opposition. Just to choose something with very little emotional weight, We know roundabouts are an incredibly effective form of traffic easement. Yes, they take a bit of learning on the part of the driver, but they are well studied. If the local government wants to and has the funds to replace a bunch of busy, difficult intersections with roundabouts, and people are nipping at their heels not to because they hate roundabouts, or they want some less effective solution, or they think people are incapable of learning to use them, is the person sitting on the fence saying, I can see the points made by both sides as valid, just standing in the way of evidence-based progress and infrastructure as much as the people who are against it. There are times when fence sitting or saying you see both sides as valid or equal is lending credence to people who are just flat out wrong, or worse, dangerous. So that's the comment. And the main thing that I want to avoid doing in this video is attacking straw men, because I understand the risk of that, and I understand that ultimately that is unproductive. I don't want to do that, but I felt like this was an interesting argument, and it has some fair points to it, but it also has some things to discuss that I believe make it invalid in critiquing the version of centrism that I'm speaking about, not necessarily invalid in every way, because maybe I don't think there's that many people that view centrism in this way, but I want to talk about it. So my first response to this is I agree 100%. If there's somebody who sees good evidence on one side, bad evidence on the other, and they're just saying, I see both sides, like they're going right down the middle, that isn't sensible. And I'm gonna explain later why I don't believe that's really what a centrist should do, or like that's not what a centrist is. It's not by definition a requirement that a centrist is literally always in the center. But my main critique is I want to say how many things are actually that cut and dry, that obvious. I don't think it's that many. I think for the most part, when we look at politics, things are really complicated, and a lot of it comes down to it comes down to a lot, and it comes down to some extent personal preference, which I'm going to speak about later, but it also comes down to, it involves a lot of facts from a wide array of areas, and ultimately, for most things, the answer isn't so cut and dry as the answer in this case is being painted. And also, is the answer even cut and dry in this case? This is something that I think is worth thinking about, because there are still considerations about the exact implementation. And I think a later argument against this post that I'm going to read out makes the argument as well that in implementation there's further things to consider. So it's not just, it's not just that roundabouts are effective, so let's implement them. That is not the end of the discussion, because ultimately decisions have to be made about how to implement them. And that is actually where more arguments can be made than simply on the argument of whether or not they should be implemented. But also this idea of personal preference, right? And in this case, I think there's an example of it as well, but it comes up a lot in politics, is sometimes people just have different personal preferences, and it's not always about truth. Sometimes people just disagree upon what they enjoy. So in this case, let's say these people have been using traditional intersections their whole lives, and they're just not that into this European crap, they don't like the roundabout because they're used to their way of doing things. And let's say, even if you think that's irrational, what if it were true we don't know. What if it were true that if these roundabouts were installed in this area where everybody is used to intersections, their lives are made worse because they're disconnected from their past and they're not living in the world that they remember. Not maybe that might be silly to some extent, but there's a certain amount of validity to that idea. And so opinion comes into play a lot. Preference comes into play a lot. And just an example that I thought of as I was considering this was, well, what about very simply like flavor preferences? This is a good example because people do vary so widely from person to person. An example could choose any food, but the example that I chose was oatmeal flavors, because I was eating oatmeal recently, and so I don't like apple and cinnamon oatmeal. I'm not a fan of it at all. I just don't like it. Especially recently. I mean, in the past, maybe I liked it a little bit, but I don't like it at all now. And I do like maple and brown sugar. And, well, I go through phases, like sometimes I like it and sometimes I don't, but sometimes I do like it, and that's never the case with apple and cinnamon oatmeal. But let's say 50% of the population likes apple and cinnamon oatmeal, 50% like maple brown sugar. Let's say we live in some kind of society where a vote is being made about which one to produce more of it. And let's just, for the sake of this example, say that you can only choose one or the other, because I guess ultimately the answer might be 50% this, 50% that, if it follow the percentage that exists in the society. But let's say you can only produce one. The votes for this one or this one are not based on fact. They're based on what one person enjoys and what the other person enjoys. And so it ultimately doesn't always come down to truth. So things aren't, basically the reason I say that and the reason that I bring up the complexity of many issues is that it's not as simple as all this. So the centrist is reasonable because there's so much doubt in the world. We can't always find clear answers to things, and I think the centrist is simply not claiming that they have answers that they don't. But I'm gonna move on to I think the next response to this that I saw on Reddit. Hopefully my editing skills are good enough that I can put it on the screen. So, and this is what they say. But that's exactly when a centrist would respond most rational. When you have one side hating roundabouts, saying they're too hard to learn, and another side being hardcore roundabouts everywhere because it's more efficient, even willing to spend millions on tearing down buildings to make room for them, then they would both make a point. And then a centrist would say, let's make a compromise. We create roundabouts where possible, and where we have the budget for and the biggest congestion points first. And we make sure that on our driving tests, we pay extra attention to roundabouts. That is literally what centrism is, a compromise. It isn't just saying, oh wow, you both have good points. No, it's acting on them and making something that both sides can agree on, even if not 100% satisfied. And then they say, and the idea that scientific facts should be the only rational course of action is ridiculous and a surefire way to authoritarianism. Sugar and fat are demonstratively bad for people's health, so we should ban all of that except for a allowed ration per day. Alcohol is all bad and causes plenty of issues, so ban it all. Roundabouts are the most efficient. Ensure you have a home and a pub and store around the crossroads over there, but we're tearing it all down because we need roundabouts, because the science says they're most efficient. That last part was a tangent. As an outside observer, I can say that. But I do think that this comment gets at a lot of the things that I was describing, and maybe I don't know how much I got from this comment when I read it, that I'm now just repeating, but I think that, yeah, there's interesting stuff to consider in there. What I like most about the comment is the idea that the centrist is dealing rationally with the subject. So that's like that's the key thing about the centrist, is that they are not attached to any one side. They're simply trying to explore what would work best, and that's what I want to look at. But I'll continue to make that argument in a moment. But I guess, like, there's a lot that I could talk about with this. Just one thing that I want to discuss is that last part that was kind of tangent. I think there's some things to say about it, so this is going to be a little bit of a detour, but I think it's worth doing, maybe. So this is such a detour, but I think that nudge theory is a very interesting political concept and economic concept, that governments essentially implement things that influence their population to make certain decisions that are ultimately beneficial for them. And part of that, it has an authoritarian tone to it, as a lot of things can be. I think a lot of things can take on an authoritarian tone, even if they might seem like they have some rationality to them. And ultimately, it is a question of how do you safeguard against the risks. But nudge theory is an interesting concept. Essentially what it is, well, I don't know if I might have already explained it, but the government puts in policies that make it more likely for their citizens to make decisions that the government deems as beneficial. Now, hopefully they deem those things beneficial through the findings of the population. But anyway, so nudge theory, anyway, I don't know what I was going to say there, but it is scientific, right? And yet the idea, the hope, is that it takes people's best interest into consideration. And the reason that I brought it up is because I think to claim that science can't do that is incorrect. So I feel like that last part kind of went against the argument that the person could have been making, because they were saying that, well, the centrists will do what's most rational. They will use reasoning to find what is most rational, present it, and take in feedback. But then they go on to talk about how science can't be used to make decisions. But I think it must be remembered that psychology is part of science, and examining human emotions is part of science as well. That's part of psychology. And ultimately, it can be used to make a determination about actually what will work based on people's psychology. And it can seem sinister, but ultimately, that is a truth that science can. I mean, maybe it's stretching the definition of science, but science is looking for truth through evidence, and it can be applied across all sorts of situations. Anyway, not sure why I brought that up, but a lot of this ultimately comes down to definition. So here's a completely different response to the same Reddit thread. It takes an interesting position, and I hope I'm not just bringing in a straw man because it feels like an argument could be made, certainly, that this is one, or that it's not a good argument. I don't know. Anyway, here it is. Define centrism. If position A is let's kill all ethnic minorities, and position B is let's not kill ethnic minorities, and the centrist position is let's kill half of ethnic minorities, then centrism is still fucking evil. Is that hyperbole? Maybe. The point is that there are some issues where giving zero ground is the morally correct choice. Pretending that both sides are valid when one side is blatantly evil is complicity with evil. It's an interesting comment. It's a charged comment, sort of emotionally charged comment. And it is a problem of definition, as they say, define centrism, and that's the ultimate problem. But the definition they gave is not how any reasonable person would describe centrism, because centrism is not about always taking the middle road. Centrism is staying away from group identification, and that's where the center comes in, because I guess the idea is that you have groups of people who have cling to an idea or concept on one side, and groups that have clung to an idea or concept on the other, and you're in the center of that because you're not going into either of those groups. Doesn't mean, though, that you cannot take what is best about what each group brings and determine which group is thinking more closely to what will actually be beneficial in any given scenario. It just means that you aren't identified with the group, which is fundamental to the benefit, to what I believe is beneficial about the centrist perspective, the centrist outlook, which is the absence of ego. That is the ultimate point about centrism, is that the thing that makes it valuable is that it takes you outside of the aspect of political analysis that can reduce your ability to think rationally, which is ego involvement that comes from group identification. And I'm going to put a photo on the screen of this popular us versus them meme that illustrates this exact phenomenon. And it shows that even in the exact same situation, like these, and it's basically a mirrored image of these castles, as you can see now. I hope my editing skills are up to the task, but as you can see now, two identical castles with different colors, but in every single other way, it's a mirrored image. And the analysis that you have of each castle's attributes, like the leader and the religion of that population, the people within the population, and all of these different aspects is altered completely by group attachment to a group identity, and it impacts rationality, because as a matter of fact, these two groups are identical, but nobody within those groups would admit to that. And fine, like if you're part of one group, this is something I think is important. If you're part of one group, it's reasonable to want your group to succeed more than the other group. Just like it's reasonable to hope that you don't get eaten by a lion, and the lion hopes that it can get some food. it's completely reasonable to have different desires than another group, even if the group is the exact same as you, but they are taking things that are the exact same as you, right? So you want these things, they want them too. There's going to be conflict there. But the point is that in the political arena, this mentality of group identification creates a reduction in our abilities to properly analyze the situation around us. That is the part that's important. So ultimately, what my hope for with this video is to describe my position that centrism is positive because it takes people and takes them outside of that group identification. It takes them outside of the exact thing that reduces our reasoning capabilities. So it is fine that if in your analysis you align much more closely with one perspective than another, that is not against the centrist viewpoint that I believe is really valuable. That is simply an analysis was made, and it was made in a certain way. But what's important ultimately is that if you take a centrist approach, you're not attached to the identity of the group. You don't have to hold every last opinion of the group. And I believe that that is where the value of centrism lies, because the value ultimately comes from remaining detached in a way that prevents the psychological precursor to reduced reasoning, which is heightened ego involvement and heightened emotion. So to me, the definition, I said multiple times that this is a problem of definition. The definition that I'm giving to centrism is that centrism is about not picking a group, not about not picking ideas or courses of action, not about not favoring particular courses of action, but putting distance between ideology and identity to sustain the ability to reason. Putting distance between what you believe and how much this impacts how you view things, or how you view yourself and others. And so that is ultimately the point I'm trying to make. And one last thing I want to talk about, this might be more important than anything I've said so far, or maybe it's not, but also it's just something that I'm thinking about. It might be a completely different topic, or it might be good to be thought about separately, but what is evil? And this comes up a lot in talk of politics, because when you get two different sides who want two different things, one side will say that the people on this other side are evil. The other side will say the exact same thing. As you saw in that Reddit post from earlier, the charged Reddit post, pretending that both sides are valid when one side is blatantly evil is complicity with evil. But what is evil, ultimately? Is it just somebody who really disagrees with you? Is it what is evil? Because this is very important. If it is possible for somebody to be evil without it being a psychological phenomenon, but rather a difference of perspective, then I guess that claim makes sense. But I just think that then we're talking about something that's a little bit different from what most people discuss when they talk about evil. Because when people talk about evil, it almost seems, it has this feeling that evil is something psychological. It's the Ted Bundy. It's Jeffrey Dahmer. It's Charles Manson. It is somebody who is psychologically incapable of feeling remorse. That might not be the case for Jeffrey Dahmer. I watched an interview from him. Very interesting, just very interesting situation there, because, I mean, who knows? But the point is that there are some people who are incapable of feeling pain, the pain and the suffering of others, and that is evil. But there's other people who are capable of feeling other people's pain and suffering. They can recognize it and they're hurt by it. But for their group and for another group, they don't feel that way. But that comes as a result of perspective, not something, not a messed up wiring. And those two things are quite different. I don't know what to do about their difference, but they are very different. So ultimately, that's just something that's interesting to me. Like, what exactly is evil? Is it something innate, like an inability to experience pain at other people's suffering on the whole? Or is it simply a difference in perspective? And I think a lot of the time when we talk about politics, the second one is the one that people are identifying. But that doesn't mean that the people on the other side are less capable of empathy. It simply means their perspective is bringing them into a way of thinking that does not value the same things that you value. But it makes me feel like maybe we shouldn't consider that evil, because, well, maybe it is. Maybe anything that goes against your own desires is evil. If evil is just a synonymous thing with just negativity being acted out upon you, then it makes sense to define that as evil. I don't know. So this was not as this didn't come out as polished as I would have hoped, but you got to start somewhere. My hope is that I can be better going forward, and please share your thoughts. Let me know what you think. I hope to continue to learn, and I appreciate whoever watched this. Thank you for watching.